Shalom, everyone. Hope you're all doing well as usual. We have quite the extensive lesson ahead of us today. We're going to try to go through it in quick succession as usual. This is quite important, I feel, and this is especially true within the Israelite community, and more on that in actually our very next episode. But we need to understand the implications of profanity, why profanity is usually used, what it does to the body, what it does to the spirit, and more importantly, what it does to others around you and how that makes you perceived in social and spiritual senses. So, without further ado, we're going to open up our scrolls to the book of Ephesians. This is going to be chapter 4, and we're going to start at verse 29. It says, "Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to use of edifying, that it may minister grace unto the hearers." So, we see for now right here, we see that the use of vulgar language, and this, of course, encompasses profanity, but it's not just profanity. You don't want to develop the habit of speaking in a way that can be considered repugnant in any way, shape, or form. But if you notice here, when we read this, it's saying to not do this, not for your sake, but for the sake of others. It says to basically cultivate the speech of the voice that can be of edification to others. And there is another scripture elsewhere that states that all of our conversations are in heaven. That is to say that the Most High is listening, right? So you want to hold yourself and tame your tongue to a higher standard of which you don't have to be ashamed of the things that you say. Okay, we're going to, let me see what I want. Okay, we're going to go down a little bit more. Verse 32 says, "And be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as the Most High, for Christ's sake, hath forgiven you." So, we see then that we are to link how we speak with the manner of which we treat people. We're going to get more into that. But if you are speaking with a repugnant fashion, with profanity, with the intention of being funny in a way that is not appropriate, it's not the kindest thing that you could do, let's say, especially if you are an Israelite, especially, or if you are simply a person that you claim to believe in the Most High, because people are going to be looking at you with heavy criticism, because people tend to judge that which has authority, right? So hold yourself to a higher standard, not for your sake just yet, but for others who are watching you. Okay, so we're going from there, we're going to go through the book of James. Those who know James, you already know we have to bring up James because he always wrote about the tongue in some way, shape, or form. So James chapter 3, and we're going to start at verse 6. Shout out to my mom, by the way. She made this bookmark for me. It says, "Da bookus." Love your mothers. They're great. Okay, so let's see. It says, verse 6. Okay, "And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity." Iniquity just means sin, which is transgression of the law. And I actually recently learned that sin is actually an archery word that means to miss the mark, which is very interesting. "So is the tongue among our members, that it defileth the whole body, and setteth on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire of hell." So there's actually a lot to unpack there, right? So we have this little thing that's between our teeth, let's say, that defiles the entire body. And I think there's a really deep reason to this that we're going to get to in further scriptures. But it says that the tongue is as a fire. So this means that the tongue has the ability to burn things, right? And what we learn as humans eventually is, when it comes to temperature in our surroundings, things that are hot tends to be things that are dangerous, and you typically want to be careful with things that have the capacity to be hot, right? And so I think what James, or one of the things that James is elucidating here, is that the amount of care that you will take with a fire, you should take that amount of care with your tongue, right? Let's say if you swallow or put a hot coal in your mouth, right? That would be harmful for the entire body. And I think that that's something to meditate on here. Being slow to speak really, really helps, because you are thinking not only about what you're going to say, but you're thinking about how it's going to affect others and how the Most High will perceive that, because we tend to be responsible for what we say to the extent of which we offend other people. It's not a good idea to offend other people, because you offend someone and then because of their offense, they do something outrageous, they miss the mark, let's say, and then that is effectively on you, especially if you have the higher authority of being, let's say, a keeper of the Most High's law. Okay, so scrolling down, let's go to verse 8. But the tongue can no man tame. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. Therewith blessed we the Most High, even the Father, and therewith curse we men, which are made after the similitude of the Most High. Very, very interesting choice of words here. I'll read the last verse, just 10 really quick. Out of the same mouth proceedeth blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so, or not so to be. So we're going to open up in meditation about what does James mean when he says, therewith we bless the Most High, even the Father, and therewith curse we men, which are made after the similitude of the Most High, right? So we get this, okay, so we know that we are, we as men, we are made in the image of the Most High. So, and then that's where it's like, yeah, the greatest commandment is, love the Most High, put nothing before the Most High, worship and love him with all your soul, might, and mind. Butchered that, but it's fine. And so then the flip side of that is to love your neighbor as yourself, and a part of that is namaste, let's say. It's like seeing the divine in your neighbor, because within your neighbor is the divine. And so in order to love your neighbor as yourself, you would need to treat them with love, correction, edification, etc. And that's why the Most High says that you can't love me if you hate your brother. It's impossible, right? Yeah, you can't love the Most High. You can't even see the Most High and you love him, yet you hate your brother and you see him every other day, right? So we're going to hold that. We're going to go to, actually, we won't hold it. We'll go to Proverbs 18 and 21. It says, actually, we'll start at verse 20. It says, a man's belly shall be satisfied with the fruit of his mouth. Satisfied with the fruit of his mouth. And with the increase of his lips shall he be filled. So essentially, what you say, what you propagate into the world, your reality with your verbiage, will be your increase, let's say. You get what you give as far as your tongue is concerned. And we see just how clear the Most High makes it, or Solomon for this matter makes it in verse 21. It says, death and life are in the power of the tongue, and they that love it shall eat the fruit thereof. And that is to say, if your tongue exchanges ideas or exchanges things that are considered vulgar and serve a overall negative message, that negative message will be your inheritance, and likewise for positive things that come out of your mouth. So the thing that I want to focus on here is that death and life are in the power of the tongue. And I think this is the thing that I wanted us to meditate on. These are my thoughts on why that is. It's because the Most High spoke everything into existence, and then he made man in his image and gave him dominion over all the things that he made upon the face of the earth, right? So in the Most High's tongue laid the inaugural spawn for everything that exists. So within that, the Most High is able to speak existence, beauty, terror, calamity, destruction, joy, hatred, etc. Everything that exists originated from the tongue of the Creator. And in order for man to be able to understand the divine in some sort of mortal fashion, he gave us the ability to speak and articulate our language in such a way that we can exude the power to speak life into someone and to speak death upon someone, blessing and cursing, right? So with all this in mind, you might think twice about using vulgar language such as profanity, swearing of any kind, or just saying things that will have negative implications and effects on the people who are listening, right? So that is one of the main, if not the biggest reason why you should want to control your tongue, because you know that the tongue is the very thing that laces the fabric of your reality. Okay, so we're going to go from there to Colossians 3 in verse 8. Colossians 3 and verse 8. It says, "But now ye also put off all these." So the following: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy communication out of your mouth. And that's the second time that we see filthy communication there. And so I wanted to bring this up after Proverbs, because Proverbs, in that proverbial literature we just read, we see that the things that we speak are the things that we inherit, right? And so then you see all of these, this is especially true in Eastern philosophy, where it's like, like manifestation and, speak into the universe, and what you put into the universe with your voice will come upon you, manifesting your destiny with affirmation, verbal affirmation, right? And that is not something that's entirely new nor foreign in the biblical anthology, because we see that everything that happens and will happen has the ability to be formulated within language. And so that communication from the divine to the creation is where we get prophecy from, if you will. So in prophecy, that's a really, I don't want to stay too long on this. I'd like to stay here, but we have lots to cover. But prophecy is a really interesting thing, because prophecy is the elucidation of what will be from the word of mouth, and then you believe that to be true based off whatever the source of that tongue being. And that's why us as children of the Most High should be very careful with how we speak, and we should strive to be professionals with our ability to articulate our message. And I'm going to cover that next week, specifically to the Israelite community, because it is so important. Okay, so I just want to cover some scientific facts here about profanity. So what swearing does, and actually I want to add this too, because this is interesting. This is just something to think about. The parts, so the amygdala, we'll get to that, but the amygdala being the emotional center of the brain, this fires in a certain way when we use swear words or profanity. And once this happens excessively, it begins to rewire our brains in a way that makes us more, how would you say? It makes us more impulsive and reactive in a negative sense. And the more and more that we do that, the more difficult it becomes to control not just what we say, but how we think as well. So, there's a lot of power indeed in the tongue. And, there was a study that was done. I forget what it was or what it was called. But essentially, science has been able to figure out that the part of the brain that is responsible for that fire, let's say, for lack of a better word, when it comes to the neurological process of swearing, is the same part in the animal's brain of a prey animal when they see a predator. So that's just interesting to think about, like when you think of like a monkey or an antelope seeing a lion or a tiger, and that like sense of urgency, let's say, that is essentially their form of swearing. And what's interesting about that as well in scientific literature as it pertains to profanity is that it's proven that swearing actually has the ability to numb our pain receptors for situations just like that, right? You're in a really big rut of a situation and you're just like, bleep, right? And then you sort of feel better after that bleep. There's a sort of, not really dopaminergic kick, but there is some sort of relief that is had because of the release of tension when you swear. But the more and more that you use that, you become desensitized to it, and it in a sense becomes akin to some sort of neurological drug, because you're trying to find some sort of verbal release for your amygdala because of a stressful situation, instead of being able to articulate something clear enough to express your frustration in a civilized way. Okay, so there's that. And then so the social aspects of swearing. People who swear tend to be perceived as less intelligent. They tend to be perceived as less intelligent, less likable, and less trustworthy. And the reason for those is because you fail to have the creativity and the cognitive ability to articulate your stance of something in a clear and formal way to where people can respect what you're saying and understand it. And someone who is reckless with their language cannot be trusted to not be reckless with, say, your finances or your relationship or your ideas, right? If you can't control your own tongue in certain settings, especially professional settings, then no one's going to hold you to that seat of credibility that you might be able to wield if you would otherwise talk like you had sense. So, that being said, I want to talk about, very briefly, Dr. Iamoto's, and Dr. Iamoto, he's technically not a doctor. He was a doctor of alternative medicine from this uncertified scientific agency. But nonetheless, he did a study on the molecular structure of water. And like plants, and I'm going to get to this, but it's like, I don't know if it's so much the plant or the water here, right? So he ran a study on the molecular structure of water and how it reacted to, honestly, the scientific heart of the matter is frequency. How does water react to frequency, right? So they found that when you speak positive things or say sweet things, because water doesn't really have a understanding of linguistics, right? So it can't really pick up on the things that you're saying, but it can pick up on the frequency of the things that you do say, right? And we know as humans that every word has its own collective weight that has either positive or negative implications, right? So anyways, the water would pick up on those positive frequencies, and then they would freeze the water into crystals, and they would find that it would crystallize into a subjectively beautiful, symmetrical fashion. Positive things being said to the water. Now, profane things were said to the water, negative things that were harsh, filled with hatred and otherwise vulgar communication was given to the water. Same thing, they froze it and looked at the molecular structure, and it was something akin to ugliness, something akin to asymmetrical chaos, right? So what that tells me is, if water has the ability to react, and granted, there are some like scientific, integral issues with the case as far as, I've read. But let's just consider this, right? Because we know that plants effectively have the same mechanisms. Like if you speak to your plants in a positive way, they'll grow faster, etc. If you don't, then the opposite reaction will occur. But if that's the case with water, then we have to think just how much our tongues actually do affect our own bodies and the body of the listener. Because on average, the adult male in society is made of 60% water. So it's like, if water is doing all of these interesting things under the negative pressures of speech, how much so for a human who's made out of 60% water and has the ability to think and receive, because brains are just as porous, if not more porous than say the flesh-like material of the plant or sponges or concrete or whatever. We might pick up on even more things because it's a frequency, right? It's a frequency of language that has its way of burrowing into our mind, and we then develop neurological patterns that sort of put us in a loquacious box. And so that's why I really love, and please, on my channel there, I talk about how to become more articulate with your speech. That is a good lecture to go observe if you are interested in talking more like a professional, if you will. Because what that will do is you'll start to talk more formal. People will start to respect what you say more because you talk with a certain clarity. And clarity is basically, you could, oversimplifying it, you could say that clarity is God, right? Because we know that the adversary, Satan, is the author of confusion. The Most High is not the author of confusion, therefore the Most High is the author of clarity, right? So the voice of clarity amidst chaos is the voice that receives the most respect, which is why Christ was so popular, right? Okay, so, and then there's a lot of philosophical connotations with that as well, right? Because Christ is the Word who made flesh of the Most High. So you would have to understand that Christ himself wouldn't speak with such vulgar language. Christ had discernment in knowing how to speak to each person, which varied from person to person, right? So, but most of the time that constitutes as professional kindness and formality, right? Okay, so closing out, let's go to Matthew chapter 12, and we'll start at verse 33. This is Christ speaking. It says, "Either make the tree good and his fruit good, or else make the tree corrupt and his fruit corrupt, for the tree is known by his fruit." In other words, the things that you do will be the consensus of your reputation, which is one of the most important things to consider when it comes to being a human being, right? The Sham, ancient Hebrew for name or title or reputation or state of existence, that is the most important thing that you can hold dear to. A good name is better to have than a plethora of things, right? So how you speak will ultimately determine what people think of you, right? So verse 34, this is Christ talking about the Pharisees. "O generation of vipers, how can ye, being evil, speak good things? For For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaketh. So what Christ is essentially saying here is, if you are a tree, or in other words, a vessel of things that have a malignant Machiavellian nature, then you are going to give and dish out the fruit of that construct. And the same for the likewise, right? So then he backs that up by saying, let's read that again. For out of the abundance of the heart or the mind, the mouth speaketh. So we know through spiritual and psychological means that, yes, the eyes might be the windows to the soul, but it's like the mouthpiece is what's inside. It shows a glimpse of what's inside of a soul, right? So the things that you say have real tangible essence of the type of character that you possess. At least that is how it's going to be perceived when you live on earth. So think very carefully about the things that you decide to say, and the things that you do say, truly mean it, and be able to have the such control over language itself to be able to masterfully communicate something to where someone can at the very least respect the vessel that the words are coming from. And that's going to conclude this video. Let's see. So, scripture of the week. This is Deuteronomy 31. I have my scrolls open. I might as well just turn to it. This is Deuteronomy 31 and verse 8. It says, "And the Most High, He it is that doth go before thee. He will be with thee. He will not fail thee, neither forsake thee. Fear not, neither be dismayed." That's beautiful. And I think that that's something that we all really need to hear from the Most High, which is His Word, aka Christ. And I think this, doesn't the scripture say that the word of the Most High is a strong tower and the righteous run to it and they are safe, right? I'm pretty sure it says that's His word, right? And so we know that the word of the Most High, or Christ, is the ultimate source of divine language that we seek clarity and doctrine and wisdom and comfort. So, good piece of advice if you want to learn how to speak better, go into the scriptures. Homework. Homework is try to go for one whole day without using profanity. If you fail, that's fine. Do 10 push-ups and keep going, right? Just try to get one whole day without using profanity. And then once you do that, try to go for a whole week. And see what happens with your mind. See what happens with how you start to develop new neurological patterns as it relates to speech. Realize the words that you're starting to replace with what would otherwise be vulgar communication. And see what kind of person you become. So that's going to conclude it. I want you guys, as always, to stay safe, especially in these times. Stay dangerous, and be wise. Shalom.